Happy Monday and welcome to Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. I'm Hogan Brock, he is Harrison Litzel, and this is a weekly video and podcast series where each week we discuss a passage from the Bible as best we can with no preparation as a way of diving into scripture each week and kind of breaking the ice. But before we get started, Harrison, how are you?
I'm doing well. It's been a busy week. I'm out of school as working at the preschool. Preschool's over for the summer, so kind of transitioning into summer mode, which means vacation Bible school, because that's what all summer is when you think about children in church, is vacation Bible school. So that's what I've been working on.
I have not been to a VBS or worked at a VBS in many years, and I don't miss it.
It is an event. It takes up a lot of time and energy, but I really enjoy. These days I don't attend so much as write, and I've been directing videos the past couple of days. We were recording a lot of stuff, and I was served as the writer director of those. So that was fun.
Okay, cool. If you're watching the YouTube version of this, you can see in the background I have a box. As I think we've talked about before on here, I'm moving soon here in just a few weeks, and so my house is chaotic, and I'm not planning for VBS, but that actually sounds like more fun to me.
Yeah, this podcast is about to go international. We're about to be international every week as we telecast around the world, I think is what we can say as our tagline.
We have no Canadian listeners, but maybe we can get one or two if I move to Toronto.
There we go.
Before we get to the text for today, a lot of churches are coming back in person to worship. I know some churches have been in person the entire pandemic or went back very soon after things closed down back in March of 2020. But for 7th Street, the church that I'm at right now, we're going back on July 11th. And Harrison, the congregation that you work at and attend, when did you all come back?
Yeah, so I'm at Smoke Rise Baptist Church and here in Stone Mountain, Georgia. We've been back kind of in different pieces and bits for a while now with different measures in place as far as distancing and masks. We are now in a place where masks are recommended rather than required, and all of our Sunday school classes are back in the building. Our Sunday school classes had kind of been on a rotating basis, but this week they actually installed pretty impressive technical setups in every Sunday school class. So every Sunday school class is now in person in the building. You can also join by Zoom and have that hybrid model for each of our classes. So this past Sunday was the first of that.
Wow. Okay. 7th Street, over the course of the pandemic, we've been meeting over Zoom. That's been our primary worship format. And so our interactions have been online through that mostly. I'm curious, how has Smoke Rise been meeting before going back in person?
So we've been doing Sunday school classes have been Zoom. And then the worship services have been through Facebook Live. And then we use I don't remember what the software, the platform is called, but we put it onto our website as well. And so for Sunday school, it's that interactive Zoom, immediate feedback kind of mode. And then for the worship services, there's some interaction as far as Facebook goes, but more of a telecast for those.
Yeah. So Harrison and I, as students in undergrad studying religion, as seminary students, as young people in the church who care about this a little bit. It's been a consistent conversation, I feel like, over the last how many years have we known each other? 8 years?
Sure.
Something like that, a while. About what we talk about the future of the church often and what the church in the future looks like. And so coming out of a pandemic, coming back to worship in person, this is something of a threshold moment. It's a changing of seasons, and so I'd be curious just to talk for a few minutes about what we see as what can we take away from the pandemic? What are we hoping for on the other side of it in terms of what we hope for church? Yeah, so let's begin there. I'm wondering if there's anything on the other side of this that you're hopeful about, that you're worried about maybe, or that you're just that you've discovered or you've thought about.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think that right now what I see at my church and with the folks that I know is just joy. It's just the excitement of being together again. And just people are excited about that. I think as people begin to feel safer and as our gathering places are able to, start doing away with some of these restrictions, we're recognizing the anxiety we've carried around with us this past year. And I think that people are just so excited to be together again. And so that's a lot of what I see right now is I think ministers especially, but I think a lot of people in the church know that this conversation is kind of looming there of this is not a conversation just you and I have. It's a conversation that lots of people have in lots of different places of where's the church going. And I think people are aware that that's waiting there for us to talk about that. But I think right now people just want to celebrate being back together and seeing each other's full faces again, and seeing them in person. I've seen a lot of excitement about that.
Yeah, for sure. And I think it is important. It's easy as someone working on staff at a church to take the long view and skip the like, oh my gosh, like we're just going to get to see each other again. I think so. Yeah, that's absolutely important to highlight. I think one of the things that I'm thinking about in terms of 7th Street particularly, but I think for other congregations as well, we're a smaller congregation. And so before the pandemic, we'd begun to have some sort of online presence. But over the course of the pandemic, we've learned like it's not necessary that people are going to come to church every Sunday morning. And so what are the ways that we can continue to engage folks throughout the week, or just make our service available online on Sunday morning for the Sundays that your kids don't want to get up or that you don't want to put on pants. And so we're thinking about that. What does meaningful community look like in those circumstances? And then I'm optimistic, a little nervous as well about the way that the traditional churches, maybe that's how I'll say it, do membership. What does it look like to be a member? It seems to me that younger folks particularly, aren't as beholden to a particular denomination perhaps, or staying in one particular congregation for their whole life, for decades. Maybe that isn't true. Maybe that's just my experience. But at 7th Street in particular, but I think some other churches I'm familiar with as well, figuring out what it looks like to be hospitable and flexible at the same time. How can we make our spaces welcoming without the assumption that this is going to be something that you're at every single week? How can you still meaningfully be a part of this community without those expectations?
Yeah. I've been a part of conversations about, my church, Smoke Rise, has really bolstered their online presence. It was there before, but has really been dedicated to it and looking to it this past year. And now there's this question of, if folks want to just stay online, is that just as good as being in person? Do we want to try to have people come back in person? Or another thing is that, geography is not as limiting. And so we have folks who have moved away who in a typical year would have found a new home church, right? They would have found a new church in their community and they would have, maybe come back to visit and things like that. But we have folks who moved away this year who are still members at Smoke Rise and still participate on a weekly basis. And so I think local churches are going to have to ask that question of, what does it mean if some of our members live several states away? Is that something that we want? Do we want them to find a new church in their community? What is this? And I think that in your conversation of membership, that's part of it. And I think thinking about young folks as well, and people our age, people younger than us, I think this past year in particular was an interesting time to be thinking about this, just because of the amount of people we saw get involved in protests and in marching and in different public events to make their voices heard. It'll be interesting to see as people start to regather back into churches, who's there and who's not, and how many young folks are around, and what that looks like, and how the conversations of racial justice of the past year are involved in that conversation, as well as we begin to think about who is the church of the future and what does the church of the future look like. Yeah,
at the beginning of the pandemic, I know there's a big conversation about our church is essential. And I think I've come to the conclusion that the answer is no. There are spiritual communities, there are meaningful communities that gather in other ways in other places, where God is at work. And I think at times God is at work more powerfully, in more beautiful ways. And I'm not saying that the church isn't important and can't be in those spaces, or that there aren't churches that are doing those things. Yeah, but I think we have to drop the assumption that we're too important to be passed up as the institutional church.
Yeah, no, that's fair.
So I think we'll go ahead and move on to our scripture. I don't know the correct way to wrap up a conversation about the future of the church because it's consistently ongoing. So if that's something that you're interested in, a conversation you're interested in having, feel free to reach out to the show. The email address should be on your screen. Reading the Bible is easyish@gmail.com. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about this as we move forward at different points. Our scripture for this week is Psalm 138. Harrison and I were talking about this a bit before we began. Harrison is familiar with Psalm 137 and 139, and as we looked at them, I am familiar with them too. But 138 is not one that I've read before, or at least one that I remember reading. So we'll be reading from the New Revised Standard Version, Psalm 138. We'll dive into it with no preparation and talk about it for around 5 minutes. So Psalm 138. I give you thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. Before the gods, I sing your praise. I bow down towards your holy temple and give thanks to your name for your steadfast love and your faithfulness. For you have exalted your name and your word above everything. On the day I called, you answered me. You increased the strength of my soul. All the kings of the earth shall praise you, O Lord, for they have heard the words of your mouth. They shall sing of the ways of the Lord. For great is the glory of the Lord. For though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly, but the haughty he perceives from far away. Though I walk in the midst of troubles, you preserve me against the wrath of my enemies. You stretch out your hand, and your right hand delivers me. The Lord will fulfill his purpose for me. Your steadfast love, O Lord, endures forever. Do not forsake the work of your hands. So, with 5 minutes on the clock, Harrison, any initial thoughts as you hear that text from Psalm 138?
Yeah, I hear echoes from all kinds of different psalms in there, right? I hear that the psalmist cried out and God answered. I hear the kind of the valley of despair that kind of echoes Psalm 23. I hear about God's right hand, about God looking at the haughty from afar. It feels like this kind of compilation of all these different threads of the ways that we think about God and the ways that we praise and respond to God. And so it's interesting to see the psalmist kind of bringing all those together in one passage, and it makes me curious to what is the psalmist responding? What has just happened? In what way has the psalmist just cried out that God has responded, and how did God respond?
Yeah, I was thinking something very similar. This is in the NRSV, at least, this is labeled as the Psalm of Thanksgiving and Praise. But it has the structure in a lot of ways of lament. It feels like the last half of lament, right? It's this acknowledging of something that has gone wrong, an acknowledgement that God was there or God was enough to get through that, and then there's a thanksgiving in this last piece, that kind of a trust that the Lord will be there moving forward. So yeah, I find that really interesting. I was caught off guard as I was reading this, the first couple of verses here. And I don't know if this is anything to make anything of, but in verse 1 it says, "Before the gods I sing your praise," which just draws me to think a little bit about the religious understanding of whoever was writing this, right? Like I don't think in a prayer that I would read in church today, I wouldn't write the gods. That'd be a little strange. So that kind of drew my attention.
I think I went through a time in college where I was really interested in this idea in the Hebrew scriptures, that the Hebrew scriptures at the beginning of their writing, in the beginning of early Judaism, that they were not monotheistic, but instead were, I believe it's called henotheism, which is this belief that there is a multitude of gods, but that Yahweh is the greatest among those gods. And there's kind of these different ideas woven throughout the scriptures where you can see this idea that the psalmist, I believe Job is another place where this is seen, and in some place it's just the use of the Hebrew and the the plural versus the singular, where you can kind of see this. And I didn't catch that when you were reading it the first time, but I do love those kind of hints at. It's a reminder how long ago these were written, and that the faith of the psalmist here is related to, and it is essentially related to our faith, but in many ways is also different. Thousands of years have passed, and our understanding of who God is different. And I think that's a good thing, and we can learn from that.
Yeah, I also really appreciate in this psalm I appreciate in the scripture when there's the acknowledgement of the breadth of power. So what I mean by that is this psalm specifically mentions kings of the earth, and then there's also that bit that talks about the lowly and the haughty, and how God relates to those. I'm always fascinated by the way that, particularly in the Old Testament, because of the way that Israel or Judea is often positioned in relation to its neighbors or other things in power around them, they're always put or often put in the lowly position. And so we see God as the God of the underdog, or God as the God of the marginalized. And so I'm interested in this pointing out of where God is present relative to power. So we have all the kings of the earth shall praise you, O Lord. So there's this notion that I think would be familiar to a lot of us who read scripture often, that God is above the kings. But then also, for though the Lord is high, he regards the lowly. So there's an acknowledgement that God is, I read that as God is close to the lowly and perceives the haughty from far away. So I'm interested. I'm not a Hebrew scholar. I think, Harrison, you've taken some Hebrew. So I'd be interested in how that's set up, what the phrasing means, where else we can find that. What is the psalmist saying in these relationships that the psalmist is pointing out?
Yeah, I do like that imagery of the kings looking up to God, but God's almost not there where the kings expect God to be. Instead, God is elsewhere with the lowly. I'm interested too in what you kind of started off with, of the idea of this sounds like the structure, the back half of a lament. And if I remember correctly, I believe that Psalm 137 is a pretty gruesome lament, one that is kind of pointed to as righteous anger, and what does it look like when we bring anger to God. And so I would be curious to kind of read 137, 138 together and see what that looks like. I don't know the creation of these two psalms and whether they're related in their origins at all, but it's interesting to think of those two together and to go from that anger to that praise, which I think is something we often see in the Psalms.
Yeah, I'm flipping back just to look at it really quickly, and whether or not these go together, that their placement next to each other seems intentional, right? That it does move from a place at the beginning of this. I mean, they're very strong language. There's fall down, there's wept, there's tormentors, right? There's a lot of crying, hand withering, this imagery, pretty harsh imagery. People chanting, tear it down to the foundations. And it kind of ends on that note before going into, I give thanks, O Lord, with my whole heart. So yeah, in a way it's an abrupt transition, but I have to think it's a little connected there as well. Any parting thoughts, anything else you'd like to look into if you were to spend some more time with this week?
I think I like that image that you kind of set up, and drawing on of the kings and those in power looking up, and God's not there. And this place of, where do we expect God to be? And we kind of look towards God being there, and making sure to ask the question, is that where God actually is, or is God somewhere else? I think that this ties back into our initial conversation about the church and what it is that we do as the church, and how we proceed forward, of making sure that where we look for God is where God says God will be, and that we're not looking in a place where there's actually the absence of God.
Yeah, I really like that. I think for me, I would be interested to read the Psalms that are around this. As you kind of talked about at the beginning, 137 and 139 are familiar to me. But I'm interested in how these are laid out. What do they say together, instead of just kind of sitting this on its own? And speaking to what you were saying a little bit there, the benediction that I shared in worship this Sunday, talked a bit about that, and maybe that's where we can leave our discussion for today. It went something like, I didn't memorize it. It went something like, "O disciples, as you go, know that you will meet travelers on the road who are experiencing God in ways that will surprise you and perhaps scare you. And know that as you go, you will be that traveler too." So may God surprise us in some scary ways from different experiences. So that's going to be it for this episode of Reading the Bible is Easy-ish. Thank you so much for joining us. Wherever you found us, I encourage you to like and subscribe and share with a friend. We'll be back next Monday discussing another topic and another bit of scripture. Until then, keep trying to read the Bible.